They say a mother always knows. They say you can feel your child's heartbeat even when they're across the ocean. But for 20 years, I lived a lie. I let myself believe the polite smiles, the Christmas cards with typed signatures, and the hushed phone calls where my daughter, Aaliyah, sounded like a ghost haunting her own life. I'm 72 years old now. My bones ache, and my eyes are clouded with age, but my mind is sharper than the butcher knife I used to keep in my kitchen back in Charleston. I've spent 2 decades watching a predator named Julian devour my flesh and blood piece by piece, while I sat on my porch and sipped sweet tea like a fool. Julian wasn't just a husband. He was a master architect of misery. He didn't hit Aaliyah where the world could see. He didn't leave marks that a doctor could report. No, Julian was far more sinister. He isolated her in that big cold mansion on the outskirts of Raleigh, North Carolina. He took her phone. He took her car keys. He took her dignity. He turned my vibrant, laughing girl into a shell of a woman who jumped at the sound of a closing door. He told her she was crazy, told the world she was fragile, and then locked the gates to make sure nobody ever found out the truth. But Julian made one fatal mistake. He forgot where Aaliyah came from. He forgot that she wasn't the only one I brought into this world on that sweltering July night 42 years ago. You see, everyone in our small town thought I only had one daughter. After the accident that took my husband, I sent Aaliyah's twin sister, Simone, to live with my sister in Chicago. It was a secret kept under layers of grief and necessity. While Aaliyah was the soft one, the one who sought peace, Simone was made of iron and fire. Simone grew up on the streets of the South Side, hardened by the cold and sharpened by the struggle. She became a woman who didn't take an ounce of disrespect from any man alive. For 20 years, Julian thought he had tamed the only woman who could challenge him. He thought he had erased Aaliyah's spirit. But 3 weeks ago, I sat in my darkened living room, looking at a photo of my 2 girls, and I realized that the time for praying was over. It was time for a reckoning. It was time for the predator to become the prey. I called Simone. I didn't have to say much. When she heard the tremor in my voice, when I told her how Julian had spent 2 decades breaking her sister's soul, I heard a silence on the other end of the line that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't the silence of sadness. It was the silence of a soldier preparing for war. "Mama," Simone whispered, her voice like grinding stones. "Tell Aaliyah to get ready. I'm coming home. And when I'm done, Julian won't even have a shadow left to call his own." The plan was simple but dangerous. It was a psychological trap that required nerves of steel. Aaliyah was terrified, her spirit crushed under 20 years of Julian's gaslighting. But when I smuggled Simone into my house under the cover of a rainy Tuesday night, and those 2 sisters looked at each other for the first time in decades, something shifted. The resemblance was terrifying. Same high cheekbones, same deep cocoa skin, same almond-shaped eyes. But while Aaliyah's eyes were filled with tears, Simone's eyes were filled with a cold, calculated venom. "He won't know," I whispered, clutching both their hands. "He thinks he owns you, Aaliyah. He thinks he knows every inch of your fear. He's never met a woman who isn't afraid of him." We spent days on the transition. Simone had to learn the limp in Aaliyah's walk, the result of a fall Julian claimed happened 5 years ago. She had to learn the stutter, the way Aaliyah lowered her gaze when a man entered the room, the way she trembled when someone raised their voice. It was gut-wrenching to watch Simone mimic her sister's trauma, but it was necessary. We were building a Trojan horse, and Julian was about to open the gates. The night of the switch, the air was thick with the scent of pine and impending thunder. Julian was away on a business trip, one of his many excuses to leave Aaliyah alone, and terrified while he indulged his own dark habits. I drove Aaliyah to a safe house 2 hours away, leaving Simone standing in that cold, oppressive kitchen in Raleigh. She was wearing Aaliyah's clothes. She was wearing Aaliyah's wedding ring, and she was holding a rage that had been simmering for 20 years. When Julian's car pulled into the driveway, I felt a shiver go down my spine from miles away. He walked through that door expecting his broken, obedient wife. He didn't know that the woman waiting for him in the shadows wasn't the victim he'd spent half his life creating. He was about to find out that some secrets don't stay buried. They come back to haunt you with a vengeance you never saw coming. Julian is about to walk into his own living room and realize that the woman he's been terrorizing for 20 years has suddenly found her teeth. But how far is Simone willing to go to break a man who thinks he's God? And what happens when Julian realizes he's sleeping next to a stranger who wants him dead? Subscribe now and hit that notification bell. This story is about to get way more interesting than you can imagine. The floorboards didn't groan when Julian walked in. They seemed to whimper. That house in the outskirts of Raleigh was a mausoleum of expensive taste and buried screams. I sat in my small cottage miles away, clutching my phone, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I knew the moment his tires crunched on that gravel. I knew the heavy, entitlement-filled thud of his boots. Julian was a man who took up space just to suffocate anyone else in it. He thrived on the smallness of others. In that kitchen, Simone stood with her back to the door. She was wearing Aaliyah's favorite faded floral apron, the one she wore when she was trying to blend into the wallpaper. Simone had practiced the slouch for 3 days. She let her shoulders hang heavy, tucking her chin into her chest. She had to be the broken woman he'd spent 2 decades molding. But under that apron, tucked into the waistband of her skirt, was a small, jagged piece of glass she'd found in the garden. She didn't need it yet, but she needed to feel its edge to remind her why she was there. Aaliyah, why aren't the porch lights on? Julian's voice boomed. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. It was the sound of a man who expected his world to be illuminated the second he graced it with his presence. Simone didn't turn around immediately. She let a beat of silence pass, just long enough to make him impatient, but not long enough to trigger his temper. She turned slowly, keeping her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. I forgot, Julian. The bulb flickered, and I got scared, Simone whispered. She had Aaliyah's voice down to a science, the slight tremor, the breathiness, the way the words seemed to apologize for existing. I had coached her on that tremor for hours. It was the sound of a woman who had been told she was worthless so many times she started to believe it was a fact of nature. Julian stepped into the kitchen, the smell of expensive bourbon and cold rain clinging to his wool coat. He didn't hug her. He didn't ask how her week had been. He walked right up to her, invading her personal space until he was inches from her face. Simone could smell his breath, stale and arrogant. He reached out a hand, and for a split second, I feared Simone would forget her role and break his wrist right then and there. Instead, she flinched. A perfect, practiced recoil. Julian chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that made my skin crawl. Still so jumpy after all these years? You'd think you'd be used to me by now. Look at me, Aaliyah. Simone slowly raised her head, but she didn't look him in the eye. She looked at his chin, her gaze shimmering with feigned terror. That's my girl, he said, his voice dropping into a chillingly intimate tone. He grabbed her chin, his thumb pressing hard into her jaw. I had a rough trip. The associates in Charlotte were difficult. I need a drink, and then I need you to remind me why I keep you around. Go to the bedroom. Don't make me wait. As Julian turned his back to walk toward the liquor cabinet, the mask on Simone's face didn't just slip. It dissolved into pure, unadulterated hatred. Her eyes, usually so bright and sharp, turned into black coals. She watched the back of his neck, the arrogant way he carried himself, the way he laughed at his own power. He had no idea that the woman he just ordered around was a professional who had dealt with men 3 times as dangerous as him back in Chicago. While Julian poured himself a double, Simone walked toward the master bedroom. Each step felt like a mile. She saw the photos on the walls, pictures of happy couple outings where Leah looked like a hostage. She saw the locks on the outside of the closet doors. She saw the cameras Julian had installed for her safety. This wasn't a home. It was a high-end penitentiary. Simone sat on the edge of the bed, the same bed where my daughter had spent 7,000 nights crying in silence. She felt the weight of the air in that room. It was heavy with the scent of Julian's cologne and the lingering residue of Aaliyah's despair. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder I'd given her. She tucked it deep under the mattress. "Tonight begins the end," she whispered to the empty room. When Julian entered the bedroom 10 minutes later, he was stripping off his tie. He looked at Aaliyah, sitting on the bed, and smiled, a predator seeing a familiar meal. "You look different tonight," he said, pausing. His eyes narrowed, scanning her face. My heart stopped as I listened to the silence over the live audio feed Simone had hidden in her collar. "Did you do something to your hair? You look stronger. It's annoying." Simone didn't miss a beat. She began to tremble, her hands shaking violently as she reached for the buttons on her blouse. I'm just tired. Julian, please. I didn't mean to look strong." The apology worked. Julian's ego couldn't process the idea of her changing. He walked over and pushed her back onto the pillows, his shadow looming over her like a shroud. "Good. Don't let it happen again. You know what happens when you forget your place." Simone lay there, staring at the ceiling, letting him believe he was in control. But in her mind, she was already counting the ways she was going to dismantle his life. She wasn't just there to play house. She was there to gather the evidence of 20 years of abuse, the hidden bank accounts, the recordings of his threats, the proof of his financial crimes that kept Aaliyah tethered to him. As the house grew quiet, Simone waited until the rhythmic snoring of the monster beside her filled the room. She sat up, her eyes glowing in the dark. She reached out and touched the bruise on her own arm, a fake one we'd applied with makeup to match Aaliyah's real injuries. "You have no idea who you're sleeping next to, Julian," she hissed into the dark. "But by the time you find out, you'll be wishing for the devil himself instead of me." The air in that Raleigh mansion felt like it was made of lead. It was 3 a.m., the hour when the world is quietest and the truth is loudest. Simone lay perfectly still, matching her breathing to the rhythmic, arrogant snoring of the man beside her. Julian slept like a king who believed his kingdom was impenetrable. He had no idea that the woman sharing his pillow was a wolf who had spent her life learning how to bite back. Slowly, agonizingly, Simone slid her legs out from under the heavy silk sheets. She didn't make a sound. She had spent years navigating creaky floors in Chicago tenements. This plush carpeting was a playground for a ghost. She stood up, her eyes adjusting to the dim green glow of the security system's control panel on the wall. Julian was obsessed with surveillance. He had cameras in the hallways, cameras in the kitchen, and cameras guarding the perimeter. He called it protection. We called it a cage. But Julian had one weakness: his vanity. He used the same 6-digit code for everything: his phone, his alarm, and the heavy mahogany door of his private study at the end of the hall. It was his birth date, followed by his initials in numbers. Aaliyah had whispered it to us in a feverish panic before we sent her away. "He'll kill me if he knows I know," she had sobbed. Well, Aaliyah wasn't here anymore. Simone was. Simone slipped out of the bedroom and glided down the hallway. She reached the study door. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hand was steady. 0-6-1-2-1-0. The electronic lock gave a soft, satisfying click. She slipped inside and closed the door behind her, the silence of the room swallowing her whole. The study smelled of expensive leather and old secrets. Simone didn't turn on the lights. She used a small, shielded pen light to scan the room. She wasn't looking for jewelry or cash. She was looking for the leash. Julian kept Aaliyah compliant through financial terror. He told her she was a co-signer on debts that didn't exist. He told her if she left, he'd make sure she ended up in a prison cell for fraud. Simone knelt behind the massive oak desk. She found the floor safe hidden under a Persian rug. Again, the code worked. The heavy steel door swung open, revealing stacks of documents, a collection of passports, and a thick, leather-bound ledger. As Simone flipped through the pages, her blood turned to ice. It wasn't just domestic control. Julian was funneling money from a local charity for underprivileged youth into offshore accounts. He was a pillar of the community by day and a parasite by night. But that wasn't the worst of it. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a manila envelope. Inside were photos, not of Aaliyah, but of me. Photos of me sitting on my porch in South Carolina. Photos of me at the grocery store. Photos of the safe house where I had sent Aaliyah. Julian hadn't just been controlling my daughter. He had been stalking our entire family. He knew where we were at every second. He was using our safety as a silent threat to keep Aaliyah in line. Every time he told her anything could happen to your mother, he meant it. He had the proof right here. A floorboard creaked outside the door. Simone froze. She clicked off the pen light and shoved the envelope into the waistband of her leggings. She stayed low, tucked into the knee-hole of the desk. The handle of the study door turned slowly. Aaliyah. It was Julian. His voice was thick with sleep, but laced with that familiar, dangerous edge. He stepped into the room, his shadow stretching across the floor like a giant. Simone held her breath until her lungs burned. She could see his bare feet just inches from where she was crouched. "I know you're in here," Julian hissed. "I heard the lock. You're getting bold, aren't you? You think because I was tired tonight that the rules don't apply?" He reached for the light switch. Simone knew she couldn't be caught hiding under a desk. That would break the illusion. She had to pivot. Fast. Just as his finger touched the switch, Simone let out a soft, jagged sob. She crawled out from under the desk before the lights came on, huddling on the floor in a ball of fake misery. When the overhead lights flared, Julian saw his wife trembling on the rug, clutching her stomach. I thought I heard a noise, Julian," Simone gasped, her voice cracking perfectly. "I thought someone was breaking in. I came in here to hide. I'm sorry. Please don't be mad. I was so scared." Julian looked down at her, his expression shifting from suspicion to a twisted kind of satisfaction. He loved seeing her scared. It reaffirmed his world order. He walked over and hovered over her, looking down like a god. "You're pathetic," he sneered, but the tension left his shoulders. "You're so broken you can't even sleep in your own bed without jumping at shadows. Get up. Go back to the room. If I catch you in my office again, I won't just yell. You understand me?" "Yes, Julian." "I'm sorry, Julian," Simone whimpered. She stood up, keeping her head down, the stolen envelope burning against her skin. As she walked past him, she felt his hand wrap around her upper arm, squeezing hard enough to leave a mark. She didn't flinch. She let him lead her back to the bedroom like a dog on a chain. But as Julian climbed back into bed and drifted off to sleep, Simone stared at the ceiling with eyes that could cut through stone. She had the evidence now. She had the proof of his theft, his stalking, and his lies. The game was no longer about escaping. It was about total destruction. Simone reached out and touched the bruise Julian had just given her. It would be the last one he ever gave any woman in this family. Tomorrow, the first move of the real revenge would begin, and Julian wouldn't even see the ceiling falling in until he was buried under the rubble. The morning sun in Raleigh didn't bring warmth. It brought a cold, clinical light that exposed every crack in Julian's polished veneer. Simone stood at the floor-to-ceiling kitchen window, clutching a mug of coffee that had gone stone cold. She was watching Julian in the driveway. He was buffing a smudge off his silver German sedan, his movements precise and obsessive. He treated that car better than he'd treated my daughter in 2 decades. I was listening through the transmitter sewn into the hem of the curtains. Every time his rag squeaked against the metal, I felt a surge of bile. But Simone was a statue. She had spent the last 4 hours memorizing the offshore account numbers from the ledger she'd photographed during the night. She wasn't just Aaliyah today. She was an executioner in a floral robe. Julian stepped into the kitchen, tossing his keys onto the marble island. The sound was like a gunshot. Breakfast, Aaliyah. I have a board meeting at the foundation in an hour. Don't tell me you've spent the morning staring at the birds again. Simone didn't flinch. She turned slowly, her face a mask of weary obedience. I'm sorry, Julian. I'll get the eggs started. I had a nightmare about Mama. Julian froze. His eyes narrowed into slits. He hated it when Aaliyah mentioned me. To him, I was the last thread connecting his victim to her humanity. Your mother is fine, Aaliyah. As long as you stay focused on being a good wife, she stays safe in that little shack of hers. Don't let your imagination wander. It's a dangerous habit. He walked toward her, his hand reaching out not to comfort, but to claim. He pinched the skin of her neck. A gesture he thought was affectionate, but was really a reminder of the leash. Simone let out a soft, submissive whimper, but inside, she was counting the seconds. I'm going to shower, Julian barked. Have my protein shake ready. And Aaliyah, try to look like you actually slept. You look haggard. The moment he vanished up the stairs, the haggard woman vanished too. Simone moved with a predatory grace. She reached into the back of the pantry and pulled out a burner phone we'd stashed behind the flour. She dialed a number she'd memorized from the stolen ledger, the personal cell of Julian's biggest donor to the Youth Horizon charity. Hello, Mr. Sterling. Simone's voice was no longer Aaliyah's. It was the voice of a whistleblower, sharp and terrified. You don't know me, but I'm a staff member at the foundation. I've seen the ledger, Mr. Sterling. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Julian is draining the scholarship fund. He's using your donations to pay off his personal gambling debts in Atlantic City. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Sterling was a man of immense pride and even more immense temper. Who is this? Sterling demanded. I can't tell you. He'll kill me, Simone whispered, her eyes fixed on the ceiling where the shower was running. But if you check the subledger hidden in his private study safe right now, you'll see the wire transfers. He's laughing at you, Mr. Sterling. He thinks you're too old and too rich to notice a few million missing. She hung up before he could respond. She wiped the phone and shoved it back into the flour. Phase 1 was complete. She had planted the seed of doubt in the only person Julian actually feared. But the real revenge, the aggressive part one had promised my girls, was just beginning. Simone walked over to Julian's protein powder. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small vial. It wasn't poison, not the kind that kills anyway. It was a potent, tasteless concoction used to induce extreme, uncontrollable tremors and a sense of impending doom. It was exactly what Julian had been doing to Aaliyah's mind for 20 years, but this time it would be his body that betrayed him. She stirred it into the chocolate powder just as the shower stopped. Julian came down 10 minutes later, looking smug in a $3,000 suit. He grabbed the shake Simone handed him and gulped it down while checking his emails. I'll be late tonight. Don't wait up. And lock the doors. I don't want you wandering into my study again, like a lost dog. Yes, Julian, Simone said, her voice dropping into that hollow, defeated tone. She watched him walk out the door. She watched him get into that shiny car. She knew that in approximately 45 minutes, right in the middle of his high-stakes board meeting, Julian's hands would start to shake. His heart would start to race. He would feel the walls closing in, exactly like Aaliyah had felt every single day in this house. But there was a twist Julian never saw coming. As he pulled out of the driveway, a black SUV began to tail him. It wasn't the police. It was Sterling's private security team. Simone watched him disappear around the corner, and then she did something Aaliyah hadn't done in 2 decades. She stood up straight. She looked at her reflection in the darkened microwave door and smiled, a cold, terrifying grin that reached her eyes. She picked up the house phone and dialed my number. Mama, the wolf just ate the bait. Tell Aaliyah to turn on the news this afternoon. It's time for the world to see the man of the year for what he really is. Are you safe, baby? I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and pride. I'm not the one who's in danger anymore, Mama, Simone replied. I'm the danger now. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked like a countdown. Simone didn't waste a single second after Julian's car faded from earshot. She knew the chemical cocktail she'd slipped into his drink would take exactly 45 minutes to hit his bloodstream. It would peak right as he stood at the head of the boardroom table, trying to lie his way through another financial audit. I sat by my phone in South Carolina, clutching a cold cup of coffee, my knuckles white. Simone had left the line open. I could hear her moving through that house, no longer the shuffling, broken wife, but a whirlwind of focused fury. Mama, I'm in his trophy room. Now, Simone whispered into her headset. You wouldn't believe the vanity in here. Awards for philanthropy, photos with the mayor, all built on the backs of children he robbed and a woman he broke. Find the keys to the safe deposit box, Simone. I urged her. The ledger was just the map. We need the treasure. Simone didn't reply. I heard the sound of a heavy drawer being yanked out and emptied onto the floor. Julian was a man of patterns. He liked to keep his leashes close. While he thought he was the master of psychology, he had forgotten that Simone grew up in a world where you had to read a person's soul just to survive the walk to the grocery store. She found it behind a false back in his mahogany desk, a small velvet-lined box containing a key and a series of high-resolution photos. I heard Simone gasp. What is it, baby? I asked, my heart skipping a beat. It's not just photos of us, Mama, Simone said, her voice trembling with a new kind of rage. It's others. Women before Aaliyah. Women he discarded when they got too old or too brave. He's been doing this for 30 years. He has a ledger of their names, their families, and the settlements he paid to keep them quiet. He didn't just marry Aaliyah. He recruited her into a cycle. Meanwhile, across town at the Youth Horizon Foundation, Julian was beginning to unravel. Thanks to the transmitter Simone had planted in his briefcase earlier that morning, I could hear the board meeting. Julian's voice was smooth at first, dripping with that fake Southern charm he used to mask his venom. And so, as we look at the third quarter projections, Julian paused. I heard a sharp intake of breath. Excuse me, as we look at the numbers. His voice wavered. I could almost see it, the sweat breaking out on his forehead, the sudden, violent tremor in his right hand. The drug was working. It mimics the physical symptoms of a massive panic attack. Your heart feels like it's trying to punch through your ribs, and your vision tunnels until you feel like you're drowning on dry land. Are you all right, Julian? A deep, cold voice asked. That was Sterling, the lead donor. I'm fine. Just a bit of a headache, Julian stammered. I heard the clatter of a pen hitting the floor. He couldn't even hold his tools anymore. Funny you should mention headaches, Sterling said, and I could hear the rustle of papers, the leaked ledger Simone had mentioned on the burner phone. Because I've been having a massive one trying to figure out why $3 million of my money just took a vacation to the Grand Cayman Islands. Care to explain these wire transfers, Julian? The ones with your private digital signature. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, the sound of Julian's chair screeching back. This is an outrage. This is a fabrication by my enemies. My wife. Aaliyah must have. Your wife. Sterling barked. Your wife can barely look a person in the eye. Julian, you've told us for years she was mentally unstable. Now you want us to believe she's a high-level financial hacker? Sit down. But Julian didn't sit. I heard him gasping for air, the drug-induced terror finally stripping away his mask. He sounded like a cornered animal. I need to go home. I'm ill. We will discuss this when I'm myself. I heard him stumble out of the room, ignoring the shouts of the board members. Simone, get out of there. I screamed into the phone. He's coming back. He's panicked. He's drugged. And he's losing everything. He's going to come for Aaliyah. I'm not leaving, Mama, Simone said, her voice as cold as a winter grave. If I leave, he'll know it was a setup. If I stay, I can finish this. I've already called the local news station. Anonymous tip about a prominent businessman having a breakdown and confessing to fraud. They're probably waiting at the gates of the mansion right now. Simone, you're playing with fire. He's a monster when he's calm. He'll be a devil now that he's ruined. Good, Simone hissed. I want to see the devil cry. I heard the roar of Julian's engine as he tore into the driveway. He didn't even park. He left the car running and slammed the front door. So hard the glass in the foyer rattled through the phone line. Aaliyah, he screamed. It wasn't a call. It was a death threat. Aaliyah, you witch. What did you do? I heard his heavy footsteps charging up the stairs. My breath caught in my throat. Simone was standing in the middle of the master bedroom. The stolen photos spread out on the bed, her arms crossed, waiting. I'm right here, Julian, she said, but she didn't say it in Aaliyah's whisper. She said it in her own voice, clear, loud, and full of a power Julian hadn't heard in 20 years. The silence that followed was the scariest thing I've ever heard. Julian had walked into the room, expecting a trembling bird. Instead, he found a statue of vengeance. The air in the master bedroom was thick with the smell of Julian's sweat and the ozone of a gathering storm. Julian stood in the doorway, his expensive suit rumpled, his tie hanging loose like a noose. His hands were twitching uncontrollably, a side effect of the cocktail Simone had fed him, but his eyes were wide and bloodshot, fixed on the woman standing by the bed. He looked at the photos of the other women spread out on the silk duvet. He looked at the stolen ledger. Then he looked at Simone. Truly looked at her. You, he wheezed, his voice cracking. What is this? Why are you standing like that? Why are you looking at me like you've got a spine? Simone didn't move. She didn't flinch. She let a slow, mocking smile spread across her face, a smile Aaliyah hadn't possessed since she was a teenager. The spine was always there. Julian, you were just too busy admiring your own reflection to notice it was growing back. Julian took a stumbling step forward, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. You think some stolen papers and a little attitude change anything? I own this town. I own the police. I own you. You're a mental patient, Aaliyah. That's what the records say. Who's going to believe a woman who's been fragile for 20 years? I'm not Aaliyah, Simone said, her voice dropping an octave into a cold, Chicago-hardened rasp. Julian stopped dead. He blinked, his drug-addled brain trying to process the words. What did you just say? I said, I'm not the woman you broke. Simone stepped toward him, closing the distance Julian usually used to intimidate. I'm the one you didn't know existed. I'm the twin sister you never checked for. I'm the debt you forgot to pay. Julian. And I've come to collect it with interest. The confusion on Julian's face was almost comical for a split second before it turned into a desperate, cornered terror. He looked at her face, searching for the submissive Aaliyah he had trained like a dog. He didn't find her. He found a woman who looked exactly like his wife, but possessed the soul of a hurricane. You're lying, he hissed, though his voice lacked conviction. This is a trick, a hallucination. I'm sick, you poison me. I didn't poison you, Julian. I just gave you a physical manifestation of the anxiety you've given my sister for 2 decades. How does it feel? Does your heart feel like it's going to explode? Good. That's justice. Julian's eyes darted to the bedside table, where a heavy marble lamp sat. He lunged for it, his instincts defaulting to the violence that had kept him in power for so long. But Julian was drugged, shaking, and 50 pounds of ego past his prime. Simone was lean, focused, and fueled by 20 years of secondary trauma. Before his hand could even touch the lamp, Simone moved. She didn't slap him. She used a tactical strike she'd learned in a South Side gym, a palm heel strike to his solar plexus that sent the air rushing out of his lungs in a sickening whoosh. Julian collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest, gasping for air that wouldn't come. 20 years, Simone hissed, standing over him like an avenging angel. 20 years of making her feel like she was the air under your feet. 20 years of telling her she was crazy while you stole from orphans. You're not a man, Julian. You're a parasite in a tuxedo. I heard the struggle through the headset. My heart was in my throat. Simone, get out. The news crews are at the gate. I can see them on the local stream. Let the world see him like this. Not yet, Mama, Simone whispered into the mic. He hasn't seen the final act. Julian looked up, his face purple, tears of pain and panic streaming down his cheeks. Please, Aaliyah, Simone, whoever you are, stop. I have money. I'll give you whatever you want. Just tell them it was a mistake. Tell Sterling it was a misunderstanding. Money, Simone laughed, and it was the coldest sound I've ever heard. Julian, look out the window. Julian crawled to the window, pulling himself up by the sill. Outside, the driveway was filled with the flashing blue lights of Raleigh PD and the bright white spotlights of 3 different news vans. Sterling was standing by the gate, talking to a detective, holding the documents Simone had leaked. Your reputation is dead, Julian, Simone said. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your charity is a crime scene. And Aaliyah, she's safe. She's with Mama. She's watching you fall on live television. But Julian's face didn't just fall, it turned gray. He looked at a small, hidden panel near the floorboards by the window. A panel Aaliyah had never mentioned. You think you won? Julian whispered, a sudden, chilling calm washing over his shaking frame. You think you can just replace her and ruin me? This house has secrets you don't know about. Twin. If I'm going down, I'm taking the one thing you care about with me. He reached for the panel and slammed his hand against a red button. Suddenly, a high-pitched alarm began to blare throughout the mansion. Heavy steel shutters, the kind you see on jewelry stores, began to slam down over every window and door in the house. The bedroom door hissed shut, and a secondary steel plate slid into place behind the wood. The room went pitch black for a second before the emergency red lights kicked in. Welcome to my panic room. Simone. Julian snarled, his voice echoing in the reinforced space. Nobody gets in. Nobody gets out. And the air? It's on a timer. Unless I put in the code, we both stay in here until there's nothing left but 2 sets of bones. The sound of those steel shutters slamming home was the finality of a coffin lid, The red emergency lights bathed the room in a sickly, crimson glow, turning Julian's sweating face into something demonic. We were cut off. The audio feed on my end hissed with static as the reinforced walls began to scramble the signal. Simone! Simone, can you hear me? I screamed into my headset. All I got back was the low hum of the ventilation system, a system that Julian had just turned into a countdown. Inside the room, Simone didn't panic. She watched Julian scramble toward the wall-mounted keypad. He was fumbling, his fingers still twitching from the tremors, his eyes darting like a trapped rat. You think you're so smart, Julian hissed, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gulps. You think you can just walk into a man's castle and tear it down. This room is airtight. In 4 hours, the CO2 levels will be too high to support life. I've lived my life in control, and I'll end it in control. We die together, or you tell me where Aaliyah is. Simone stood in the center of the crimson light, her shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a judge. You've been living in a vacuum for 20 years, Julian. You really think you're the only one who knows how to prepare for a siege. She reached into the small of her back. She didn't pull out a gun. She pulled out a small, heavy-duty industrial magnet and a thin copper wire. What is that? Julian sneered, leaning against the wall for support. A toy? You think you're going to pick a digital deadbolt with a wire? I'm not picking the lock, Julian, Simone said, her voice steady and terrifyingly calm. I'm short-circuiting your ego. She moved toward the keypad. Julian lunged at her, his desperation lending him a sudden burst of strength. He swung a heavy fist, but Simone ducked under his arm with the fluidity of a shadow. She grabbed his wrist, twisted it behind his back, and slammed him face first into the very steel shutter he had just deployed. The sound of his nose breaking echoed in the silent room. Stay down, she whispered in his ear. Every breath you take is less air for me, and I'm starting to find your presence very expensive. She turned her attention to the keypad. While Julian groaned on the floor, clutching his face, Simone began to work. She knew these high-end security systems. They were designed to be impenetrable from the outside, but they relied on a central processor that sat just behind the plastic housing of the internal interface. Outside, the Raleigh police were using a battering ram on the front doors, but the mansion was built like a fortress. On the news feed, I could see the chaos. Reporters were shouting over the sirens, telling the world that the philanthropist of the year had barricaded himself inside with a woman they believed was his wife. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know the switch had already happened. Mama, if you can hear me, Simone muttered, hoping the signal would catch a fragment of her voice. Tell Aaliyah to look for the blue folder in my bag, the one I left in the safe house. It has the names of the construction crew Julian used to build this room 10 years ago. One of them was a cousin of mine. Every fortress has a back door. I heard it. It was faint, buried under the static, but I heard it. I turned to Aaliyah, who was huddled on the sofa, her eyes glued to the TV. The blue folder. Aaliyah, get the folder. Aaliyah scrambled, her hands shaking, but she found it. Inside was a blueprint, not the official one filed with the city, but a hand-drawn sketch. There was a manual override for the ventilation shaft, hidden behind a decorative molding in the ceiling of the master closet. Simone! The closet! I yelled, praying the signal would pierce the steel. The molding in the closet! There's a manual release. Inside the red-lit room, Simone heard a ghost of my voice. She didn't hesitate. She dragged Julian by his collar toward the walk-in closet. He was semi-conscious now, the combination of the drug and the impact with the door leaving him dazed. She stepped into the closet, feeling along the ornate crown molding. Her fingers brushed against a small, recessed lever. But as she reached for it, Julian's hand clamped around her ankle. He pulled hard, sending her crashing to the floor. He was laughing now, a wet, gurgling sound. You think it's that easy? He wheezed. I moved the release, Simone. I knew someone would try to find it. I'm the only one who knows where the real one is. And I'm going to watch the light go out of your eyes. He pulled a small, silver remote from his pocket. This doesn't just lock the doors. It cuts the oxygen intake entirely. We have 20 minutes. He pressed the button. The low hum of the ventilation died instantly. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I've ever felt. The silence was a physical weight. Every second that passed felt like a minute, and every breath felt thinner, like sucking air through a straw. The red emergency lights pulsed slowly, mimicking a dying heartbeat. Julian lay on the floor of the closet, his face a mess of blood and sweat, but his eyes were wide with a manic, suicidal triumph. He was a man who had lost his money, his reputation, and his power. All he had left was the ability to take Simone with him. You feel that? Julian croaked, his voice a dry rasp. That's the air leaving. It's getting tight, isn't it? My chest feels like it's in a vice. But yours must feel like it's burning. Simone didn't answer. She stood in the center of the closet, surrounded by Aaliyah's designer dresses, clothes that were bought to turn her sister into a mannequin. Simone was breathing through her nose, slow and rhythmic. She was a woman who had survived the harshest winters and the tightest corners. She wasn't going to let a man like Julian dictate her last moments. She reached into her hair. Hidden within the thick braids she'd styled to match Aaliyah's was a small, high-tensile ceramic blade. It was non-metallic, designed to pass through the high-end scanners Julian had at the front door. She didn't move toward Julian. She moved toward the back wall of the closet, where a full-length mirror was bolted to the frame. What are you doing? Julian spat, trying to push himself up. There's no way out. That's reinforced concrete behind that glass. I built this place to be a tomb. Every tomb has a weak point, Julian, Simone said, her voice eerily calm despite the thinning air. You were so worried about people getting in, you forgot that houses settle. You forgot that pipes need to run. And you forgot that Aaliyah told me about the leak. She remembered what Aaliyah had whispered during those long nights of planning. In the back of the closet, the wall always feels cold. Julian says it's nothing, but I can hear the water running behind the drywall when I'm alone. Simone slammed the base of the ceramic blade into the corner of the mirror. It shattered into 1,000 jagged diamonds. Behind it wasn't concrete. It was standard drywall covering a plumbing access panel. Julian had lied. He was a master of the bluff, and he'd almost won because he'd convinced Simone the room was more high-tech than it actually was. You're bluffing, Julian screamed, scrambling toward her on his hands and knees. That's just a service panel. It leads to a 4-inch pipe. You can't fit through there. I don't need to fit through it, Simone hissed. She ripped the drywall away with her bare hands, her fingernails bleeding as she tore through the plaster. I just need the pressure to change. She found the main water line for the master suite. It was a heavy copper pipe. She took the small, high-tensile wire she'd used earlier and wrapped it around the pipe's pressure valve. With a violent, desperate yank, she sheared the valve head off. A geyser of high-pressure water exploded into the room. What are you doing? Julian shrieked as the cold water began to flood the closet floor. You're going to drown us even faster. No, Julian, Simone said, the water drenching her to the bone. I'm triggering the fire suppression system. The mansion was equipped with an advanced moisture and heat sensing fire grid. By rupturing the main line and creating a localized flood in the sealed room, the house's central computer would register a catastrophic pipe failure. In a high-end smart home like this, a flood was considered a greater threat to the structure than a lockdown was to a person. The computer made a split-second decision. To prevent the water from destroying the electrical grid of the entire floor, it triggered an emergency drain and vent protocol. Clack, clack, hiss. The steel shutters over the closet vent groaned and slid open 3 inches to let the air pressure equalize. It wasn't much, but it was a lifeline. Fresh, cool air rushed into the room, cutting through the stagnant CO2. Outside, the police heard the sound of the internal systems shifting. They're moving. The vents are opening, a detective shouted. Julian watched his unbreakable room fail him. He watched the woman he thought he'd killed standing in the middle of a waterfall, her eyes glowing with a cold, righteous fire. He realized then that he hadn't just lost his house. He had lost his mind. He lunged for the ceramic blade Simone had dropped, his eyes wild. But Simone was faster. She stepped out of the water's path and delivered a spinning back kick that caught Julian square in the jaw. He hit the floor hard, his head splashing into the rising pool of water. Simone grabbed the silver remote from his pocket. She didn't press the unlock button. She looked at Julian, who was shivering and defeated in the 2 inches of water on the floor. "You wanted to be in control, Julian?" Simone asked, her voice echoing over the roar of the broken pipe. "Then you stay in here. I'm going to let the police find you like this, wet, broken, and shivering in a room full of your own lies." She walked to the keypad, used the copper wire to jump the final circuit she'd been working on, and the heavy bedroom door finally slid open with a hiss. As she stepped out into the hallway, she saw the flashlights of the SWAT team coming up the stairs. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She held up her hands, drenched and bruised, but standing tall. "My name is Simone," she shouted over the sirens. "And the man you're looking for is in the closet. Don't worry about the water. He's used to making people feel like they're drowning." The world outside the mansion was a sea of blue and red strobes. Julian was dragged down the front steps, his face a swollen mask of defeat, his custom-tailored suit dripping with the foul water of his own panic room. The news cameras caught, every second, the man of the year looking like a drowned rat. I watched the feed from my kitchen table, my hand trembling as I held Aaliyah's. For the first time in 20 years, my daughter wasn't looking at the floor. She was looking at the screen, her eyes wide, her breath steady. "He looks small, Mama," Aaliyah whispered. "He always felt like a giant, but he looks so small." "Because he is small, baby," I replied. "He just spent 2 decades standing on your shoulders to look tall." But the police taking Julian away was only the beginning. Simone had promised an aggressive revenge, and she wasn't done. While the detectives were busy processing the scene, and Sterling was breathing down the neck of the district attorney, Simone was back inside the house. The police thought she was Aaliyah, the traumatized victim, so they gave her a moment of privacy to collect her things before taking her to the station for a statement. They didn't realize they were leaving a professional saboteur in a room full of digital evidence. Simone didn't go for the jewelry. She went for the server room, hidden behind the wine cellar. Julian was a man who recorded everything. He had cameras in every room to keep Aaliyah under his thumb, but those cameras had also captured him. They had captured his meetings with corrupt city officials. They had captured him moving money on his laptop. They had captured the moments where he dropped his mask and showed the monster beneath. Simone pulled a flash drive from her pocket, one we had prepared weeks ago. She didn't just copy the files. She set up a dead man's switch. "If he tries to use his lawyers to bury this," Simone muttered to herself, her fingers flying over the keyboard, "the whole world gets the unedited version." She didn't just target his bank accounts. She targeted his legacy. Julian's name was on buildings, on scholarships, on the very fabric of the city's elite social circles. Simone began a mass email blast scheduled to go out to every single one of his donors, business partners, and friends. Attached was a video, not of his crimes, but of his confession in the panic room. The sound of him admitting he'd rather die and kill his wife than lose his money. By the time Simone walked out of that house for the final time, Julian's reputation wasn't just dead. It was being cremated. I met Simone at a diner on the outskirts of town an hour later. We had Aaliyah tucked away in the back of my old sedan. When Simone walked through the door, still damp, her eyes glowing with the fire of a successful hunt, I stood up and hugged her so hard I thought my old ribs would snap. "Is it over?" I asked. "The police have the ledger. Sterling has the proof of the theft. And the internet has the video of who Julian really is," Simone said, sliding into the booth. She looked at Aaliyah. "But there's one more thing." She handed Aaliyah a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was the combination to a private vault Julian kept in a different city, a vault he'd mentioned in his drug-induced rambling. "That's your future, Aaliyah," Simone said. "There's enough untraceable cash in there to buy back every second he stole from you. It's not his money anymore. It's the tax he owes for your soul." Aaliyah looked at the paper, then at her sister. For the first time, she didn't look afraid. She looked hungry. "He always told me I was nothing without him. He told me I'd starve on the streets." "Well," I said, taking both my daughter's hands, "the only one starving now is Julian. He's going to spend the rest of his life eating prison food while we rebuild what he tried to burn." But as we sat there, the news on the diner's TV flickered. The reporter was standing outside the courthouse. "Breaking news! Julian's lawyers are claiming the evidence found in the mansion was obtained illegally. They are pushing for an immediate release on bail, citing his deteriorating mental health and the unreliable nature of his wife's testimony." The color drained from Aaliyah's face. "He's going to get out, Mama. He's going to find us." Simone stood up, her face hardening into a mask of pure granite. "He can try, but he's about to find out that the wife he's going to sue isn't the one he needs to worry about. We're going to the courthouse. Right now." The courthouse in Raleigh looked like a Greek temple, all white marble and tall pillars meant to represent blind justice. But I've lived 72 years as a black woman in the South. I know justice isn't blind. She just needs her eyes opened by force sometimes. Julian's high-priced lawyers were already on the steps, preening for the cameras, spinning their lies about illegal searches and mental instability. They thought they were dealing with a broken woman. They didn't know they were about to walk into a two-headed storm. We pulled up in my old sedan. I was behind the wheel, Simone was in the passenger seat, and Aaliyah was in the back. Aaliyah was trembling, but it wasn't the tremor of fear anymore. It was the vibration of a caged bird about to fly. "You ready, baby?" I asked, looking at Aaliyah through the rearview mirror. "I've been ready for 20 years, Mama," she said. Her voice was thin, but it was clear. Simone turned around, her eyes locking onto her sister's. "Remember the plan. We walk in together. We don't say a word until the judge asks. We let them see the truth with their own eyes." As we stepped out of the car, the media swarm descended like locusts. Microphones were shoved in our faces, flashes blinded us, and reporters screamed questions about Julian's health. Simone and Aaliyah were dressed identically, deep charcoal suits, hair pulled back tight, silver earrings glinting in the sun. They looked like two halves of the same soul. The courtroom was packed. Julian sat at the defense table, looking significantly better than he had in the closet. His lawyers had pumped him full of fluids and pride. He looked smug, leaning back, whispering into his attorney's ear. He thought he'd won. He thought that Aaliyah standing in the doorway was the same one he'd crushed under his thumb. The judge pounded the gavel. "Mr. Julian's counsel, you may proceed with the bail hearing." The lead lawyer stood up, a man with a voice like polished grease. "Your Honor, My client is a victim of a coordinated character assassination. The woman claiming to be his wife has a history of psychological breaks. The evidence found was planted during a period of documented domestic turmoil. We move for all charges to be dropped and for Mr. Julian to be released immediately. Julian turned in his chair to look at us, a cruel, triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He mouthed the words, "You're dead." That's when I stood up. At 72, my voice can still shake the rafters of a church. Your Honor, the defense is right about one thing. There has been a deception in this marriage. But it wasn't my daughter who lied. It was Julian. Sit down, ma'am. The judge barked, but the cameras were already rolling. Simone and Aaliyah walked forward, side by side, toward the witness stand. The entire room went silent. You could hear a pin drop on that mahogany floor. Julian's smirk didn't just fade, it disintegrated. He looked at Aaliyah, then at Simone, then back to Aaliyah. His face went from pale to gray to a sickly, mottled purple. Which one of you is his wife? The judge asked, leaning forward, his glasses sliding down his nose. I am, Aaliyah said, her voice ringing out like a bell. I am the woman he locked in a room for 20 years. I am the woman he told was crazy. I am the woman whose life he tried to erase. And Simone stepped forward, her voice a low, dangerous growl. Am the woman who went in to get her. I am the evidence, Your Honor. I am the witness to the monster he becomes when the doors are locked. Aaliyah pulled a small remote from her pocket, the secondary one Simone had recovered from the server room. She didn't wait for permission. She pressed play. The giant screens in the courtroom flickered to life. It wasn't the panic room footage. It was a secret recording from 3 years ago. Julian in his study, laughing with a city councilman about how he trained his wife to never speak unless spoken to. It showed him hitting her. It showed him forcing her to sign papers while she sobbed. It was 20 years of brutality condensed into a 5-minute nightmare. The courtroom erupted. Julian leaped up, screaming, "Turn it off! That's private! That's mine! It's the truth, Julian!" I shouted over the chaos. And the truth is a debt that finally came due. Julian lunged toward the sisters, his hands outstretched like claws. But Simone was ready. She didn't even wait for the bailiffs. As he reached the railing, she delivered one final, crushing blow, a straight punch that broke Julian's spirit and his jaw simultaneously. He collapsed in a heap at the feet of the wives he'd tried to destroy. The judge didn't just deny bail. He ordered Julian held in maximum security pending a trial for kidnapping, embezzlement, and aggravated assault. As the officers hauled him away in chains, he looked at Aaliyah. For the first time, he saw her. He saw the woman who had survived him. "I'll kill you," Julian screamed as they dragged him through the side door. "I'll kill both of you." "You're already dead, Julian," Aaliyah whispered to the empty air. "You just haven't stopped breathing yet." We walked out of that courthouse into the bright afternoon sun. My daughters held my arms, one on each side. We didn't look back at the mansion. We didn't look back at the rubble of Julian's life. We looked toward the horizon. 20 years of silence had been broken by the sound of two sisters coming home. My name is Hattie Mae, and I might be 72 years old, but I've learned one thing. If you mess with a mother's cubs, you better be prepared for the lioness to tear your world apart. Julian is behind bars, facing a life sentence, and Aaliyah is finally breathing fresh air. But the story doesn't end here. There are thousands of Julians out there, and thousands of Aaliyahs waiting for their sisters to come for them. This wasn't just a switch, it was a revolution. Thank you for following this journey of blood, betrayal, and the ultimate revenge. If you want to see more stories where the villains get exactly what they deserve, you need to hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. Comment victory if you think Julian got what was coming to him. Share this video to let the world know the silence is over. This is vintage vengeance, and we never forget. Would you like to see what happened to the money Julian hid? Let me know in the comments for a potential sequel.